Welcome to the debate. So 74%,
That is a wild statistic to start with.
right? But according to recent surveys of ethically non-monogamous couples, that is the exact percentage of participants practicing hotwifing who say the anticipation and, the planning of their partner sleeping with someone else is actually more exciting than the sex itself.
Which really flips the script on how we usually view this.
Exactly. And for our audience of marriage counselors, psychotherapists, and clinical sexologists tuning in, that number should completely upend how we evaluate contemporary relationship trends. We are looking at a dynamic that actively leverages third-party sexual encounters, not as an exit strategy, but, well, as a deeply complex mechanism for marital maintenance.
Yeah, a mechanism that is highly controversial in clinical circles, I might add.
Oh, absolutely. Which brings us to the core question we're examining today. Does this practice actually serve as a legitimate relationship stabilizer that builds profound emotional literacy, or is it just a highly precarious path that inevitably leads to heartbreak and toxicity? I argue that hotwifing, primarily through its absolute requirement for extreme emotional transparency and boundary setting, effectively functions as a stabilizer that paradoxically enhances both emotional and physical intimacy for the primary pair bond.
And I contend that this practice frequently functions as basically a highly volatile distraction. It's a superficial intervention that masks deeper, unaddressed marital dysfunctions while introducing catastrophic emotional risks, primarily through the highly predictable danger of developing outside emotional bonds.
Okay, to really evaluate those risks versus the rewards, I think we have to isolate the clinical mechanisms at play here, right? We have to completely divorce this from traditional infidelity.
Sure, the contexts are entirely different.
Right, because traditional infidelity relies on deception. It's a unilateral shattering of the couple's structural agreement. Hotwifing, conversely, is built entirely on a rigorous pre-negotiation and mutual consent. When we look at the clinical data, specifically a recent survey of over 1,000 committed couples, 71% report a stronger emotional bond. And another 71% credit the practice with actively improving their sex lives. What we're seeing is a genuine psychological shift. The dynamic has moved away from the degradation often associated with traditional cuckolding. Instead, it centers on what participants call a trophy dynamic.
A trophy dynamic.
Right. Yeah, it fosters a shared fantasy. The husband recognizes his partner's high desirability to others, but the arousal is routed directly back into the primary marriage. It doesn't dilute the bond, it revitalizes early-stage desire.
Look, I understand the appeal of those statistics, I really do. But as clinicians, we have to look strictly at the methodology behind that 71%. You're citing self-reported data primarily from couples who are actively in the honeymoon phase of this lifestyle.
Well, they're the ones participating in the surveys.
Exactly. But the longitudinal clinical data, what these same couples look like 3 or 5 years later, that paints a completely different reality. My concern here is that this empowerment narrative is incredibly seductive, but it frequently acts as a temporary band-aid for failing marital mechanics.
A Band-Aid?
Yes, a Band-Aid. We are seeing couples dealing with profound sexual boredom, dead bedrooms, or physical dysfunctions who use this third party to generate an intense, triangulated dopamine hit. It just glosses over the foundational cracks in the marriage.
But if that dopamine hit revitalizes their connection, why dismiss it as a Band-Aid? Let's look at the neurobiology of long-term pairing for a second. Clinical psychologist Dr. Como Manchini observes that responsible hotwifing intentionally introduces novelty to activate the brain's habituated reward system.
Right, because novelty fades.
Exactly. In a marriage of 10 or 20 years, dopamine receptors naturally downregulate in response to the familiar partner. Esther Perel talks about this constantly, the inherent tension between our need for security and our need for autonomy and surprise.
I know Perel's work well, yes.
So hotwifing injects the neurochemical rush of a brand new encounter, but because it's orchestrated together, that rush is experienced cooperatively. The husband experiences a surge of pride and arousal rather than emasculation. It is quite literally an intentional, collaborative hijacking of the novelty-seeking brain to benefit the primary pair bond.
See, I come at it from a completely different way. That intentional hijacking you're describing is exactly what makes it an artificial crutch.
How so?
Well, psychotherapist Priyanka Kapoor's analysis of this is vital. She points out that the drive toward this dynamic frequently masks organic issues. Take erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation, or simply a profound loss of emotional intimacy.
Okay, but those are separate clinical issues.
Are they?
If a husband feels inadequate, outsourcing the sexual function to a third party is an avoidance strategy. Yes, the novelty Dr. Manchani speaks of activates the reward system, but it does so externally. If the only way a couple can generate an erotic charge is by bringing a stranger into the equation, the internal mechanics of the marriage are broken. They aren't repairing their intimacy. They are outsourcing the labor of arousal.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the outsourced sexual act replaces the marital bond rather than reinforcing its unique primacy. Think about how participants themselves contextualize this. Consider the common car test drive metaphor that's so prevalent among men in this community.
Oh, the car metaphor? Right.
Yes. A husband will often describe the arrangement by saying, it's like letting someone test drive your highly prized sports car. They get to see how beautifully it handles, but at the end of the day, the keys come back to me. It's my car.
Which is incredibly objectifying, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. Setting aside the obvious objectification to focus purely on the psychological utility, though, doesn't this metaphor serve as a highly effective defense mechanism that protects the marital power dynamic? The husband maintains psychological ownership. He safely introduces extreme novelty while definitively reinforcing who the primary partner is. The third party is merely a temporary guest in a structure the husband owns.
Honestly, the fact that they have to use a mechanical loan as a defense mechanism proves how fragile the emotional reality actually is.
Fragile? It's a boundary.
It's a delusion. That metaphor drastically oversimplifies the complexity of human attachment. A car doesn't develop feelings for the person taking it for a spin. A human being does. You're talking about incredibly complex psychological interplay, and reducing it to a vehicle loan is just a way for the husband to intellectualize the scenario so he doesn't have to confront the very real threat of replacement.
I think you're underestimating their awareness of that threat.
Look at it through the lens of John Bowlby's attachment theory. What happens when the test drive goes too well? What happens when the wife decides she actually prefers the emotional availability or the humor of the temporary partner? The power dynamic you're describing is an illusion maintained entirely by the naive assumption that the wife's emotions will remain neatly compartmentalized.
Wait, but that fear of replacement, that exact fear you're talking about, is precisely what forces these couples into a state of hypercommunication. According to sexologist Dr. Tara, the true therapeutic value of this lifestyle isn't the physical act. It is the profound emotional literacy forged through intensely over-communicating boundaries.
Over-communicating doesn't mean you can control the outcome, though.
No, but they don't just hope the wife won't catch feelings. They sit down and ruthlessly interrogate that exact scenario. They ask, what if you bond with him? What are our hard limits on texting afterward? That's why the planning phase is more exciting for them, going back to that 74%. They are essentially engaging in intensive, self-guided couples therapy. They are building a shared fantasy that requires a level of vulnerability most traditionally monogamous couples never achieve.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. I really don't.
Why not? The data shows it works.
Let me tell you why. That idealized version of emotional literacy looks fantastic on a whiteboard in a therapist's office. But the execution in the real world is incredibly messy and full of psychological harm. Couples are utilizing digital platforms like Wifey, Field, and Pineapple to source these third parties. Sometimes they bring in complete strangers. Other times, they make the catastrophic error of bringing in existing friends.
Well, bringing in friends is usually a rookie mistake.
But it happens constantly. And when you introduce a third human being with their own desires, their own unpredictability, their own ego, you introduce chaos. The husband often faces immense performance anxiety afterward, comparing himself to the younger or more fit third party. And the wife, who, as psychotherapists constantly warn, often connects through personality and lifestyle rather than purely physical metrics, she crosses that boundary. It shifts from a purely physical arrangement into an emotional bond.
But that's the exception, not the rule.
It's a very common outcome. That is not emotional literacy. That is opening the door to an anxious avoidant trap under the guise of enlightenment.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Isn't confronting that intense somatic jealousy head-on Much like stress testing a bridge?
Stress testing?
Yes, in traditional monogamy, jealousy is this latent, terrifying force. It's the phantom in the room that couples spend decades tiptoeing around. But in hotwifing, it's a form of exposure therapy. The couple deliberately engineers a scenario that triggers their deepest fears of inadequacy and jealousy, and then they survive it together.
Wow, that's quite a spin.
Hear me out. By actively enduring the stress of an external physical encounter, by watching the wife with someone else and realizing that she still comes home, that she actively chooses the marriage over the novelty, the couple proves to themselves that their emotional infrastructure is unbreakable. They aren't avoiding the storm, they are sailing directly into it and proving their ship is watertight.
That is a fascinating way to frame it. But clinical observation tells us most ships are not watertight. Stress testing a bridge only works if the materials are perfectly forged to begin with, and human egos are famously porous.
They get stronger through the process, though.
Do they? When a couple deliberately engineers a scenario to trigger somatic jealousy, they are completely ignoring how the amygdala actually processes trauma. The lived experience of balancing the thrill of the taboo against the crushing weight of biological jealousy is incredibly precarious. You say they survive the storm together, but many of them do not.
Some fail, sure, but
Eroded, and the emotional distance becomes an absolute chasm. The sheer emotional risk of traumatizing the primary attachment figure completely outweighs the theoretical reward of this so-called stress test.
And this is precisely why the concept of risk mitigation is the absolute bedrock of the practice. The stress test doesn't end when the physical act concludes. It relies entirely on the immediate aftermath. Dr. Jess O'Reilly highlights the critical importance of structured post-encounter debriefing sessions.
Oh, right, the debrief.
Yes. Think of this debriefing as a hyperbaric chamber for relational decompression. If the encounter was positive, they use that shared memory to fuel their own physical connection. If it triggered unexpected jealousy, this chamber provides a highly controlled space to process the emotional bends.
Assuming they can control it.
They sit down, they downregulate their nervous systems together, they refine their hard limits, and they reaffirm their primary commitment. This continuous shared reflection takes a potentially explosive encounter and transmutes it into a profound building block for marital security.
But the fragility of that hyperbaric chamber is exactly what concerns me. A successful debriefing session is highly dependent on both partners possessing exceptional emotional regulation and self-awareness, immediately following a highly charged, potentially traumatic adrenaline dump.
Which they practice over time.
But if the husband is reeling from profound feelings of inadequacy because the third party performed in a way he cannot, a structured conversation isn't going to magically process that trauma. Furthermore, we can't ignore the external pressures weighing on this chamber. These couples do not exist in a vacuum.
True, there's societal pressure.
Enormous pressure. They carry the heavy burden of intense social stigma, guilt, and the taboo nature of what they are doing. The societal judgment alone is crushing. When the internal debriefing fails, when the somatic jealousy cannot be simply talked away, and those external pressures compound, the relationship rapidly becomes toxic. We see these couples in clinical therapy not to refine their boundaries, but desperately trying to undo the immense psychological damage they've inflicted on each other.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Doesn't navigating that profound societal judgment together actually force the couple into a fiercely protective, us-against-the-world mentality?
I don't know if I'd call it fiercely protective.
Well, if we look at Murray Bowen's concept of the differentiation of self, these couples are actively defining their own relationship outside of societal norms. They are sharing a profound, highly stigmatized secret. In many ways, the external pressure you're describing acts as a secondary bonding agent.
A secondary bonding agent?
Exactly. They have to rely entirely on each other for emotional validation, because the outside world will readily condemn them. That stigma solidifies the very stability you claim it threatens, because it reinforces that their understanding of intimacy transcends traditional rulebooks. It creates a microcosm where their mutual trust is literally the only currency that matters.
That us-against-the-world bonding agent only works if the internal trust remains absolute.
If there is a microscopic fracture in that trust, like say a lingering text message sent to the third party outside of the agreed upon hours, or a failure to fully disclose an emotion during your hyperbaric debrief, that mentality collapses into severe paranoia.
Obviously, breaches of the agreement cause problems.
But the isolation caused by the social stigma means they have absolutely no external support system when things go wrong. They can't exactly complain to their traditional friends or family about the fallout of a hot-wifing encounter. So when the toxicity sets in, it ferments in a sealed container. The secrecy doesn't just bind them together, it traps them together when the arrangement inevitably turns sour.
Well, as we step back to look at the full clinical picture, I maintain that when executed with profound emotional literacy, meticulous boundary setting, and structured, honest debriefing, hot-wifing can indeed serve as a powerful relationship stabilizer. By consciously introducing novelty and utilizing exposure therapy to safely navigate jealousy, couples can revitalize their physical intimacy. More importantly, they forge an unbreakable emotional transparency and differentiation that traditional monogamy, with its unexamined assumptions, often fails to cultivate.
And I maintain that despite the theoretical, highly intellectualized frameworks, the severe practical risks make it a highly probable path to heartbreak. The danger of accidental emotional attachment, the likelihood that this practice is merely triangulating intimacy to mask deep-seated dysfunctions, and the sheer volatility of the human nervous system in the face of jealousy mean that for the vast majority of couples, the fallout will far outweigh the temporary thrill.
I think where we fundamentally converge today is on the absolute necessity of preparation and structural integrity. We both agree that without extreme emotional clarity, rigorous and ongoing communication, and a pre-existing foundation of unshakable trust, introducing a third party is a guaranteed disaster. It is certainly not a casual weekend experiment or a quick fix for a functionally dead bedroom.
Precisely. If a marriage's foundational attachment is already compromised, throwing the unpredictable variable of a third human being into the mix to see if the structure holds is tantamount to clinical malpractice.
Which leaves the ultimate question to you, our audience of marriage counselors, psychotherapists, and clinical sexologists. Is hot-wifing an inherently destructive, taboo practice that inevitably shatters trust? Or is it a highly stigmatized, unconventional intervention that might actually save and elevate certain modern marriages? The clinical data on consensual non-monogamy is evolving rapidly, and there is much more to explore in the literature regarding how these couples regulate their bonds.
The variables of human attachment are incredibly complex, and the line between profound vulnerability and reckless psychological damage is razor thin.
Indeed it is. So, to leave you with a final thought, when a couple invites you to look at their relationship and they tell you they are willingly stress-testing their emotional bridge with the weight of external desires, are you looking at a structure that is fundamentally cracked and about to collapse, or are you looking at a structure uniquely fortified to withstand absolutely anything? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.